Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akkad and Koka Report. I'm Michel Akkad in San Francisco, and I'm joined by Anish Koka in Philadelphia. We are delighted to have as our guest a man who will share with us his unique perspective as a patient with a chronic and progressive illness. We are going to have a very important discussion about the nature of health and illness that I am sure will give physicians and healthcare professionals in the audience much to think about. Pat Caslin is a business strategist from Dublin, Ireland, who's had a successful career nationally and internationally, working for a variety of financial and business development institutions. 11 years ago, he was diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And 5 years ago, the disease became progressive, and he lost his ability to walk. Instead of letting the illness take over his life, Pat went through a profound change of perspective regarding his health and what it means to be healthy. As a result, he has been sharing his insights both in writing and in speaking engagements with medical students, with physicians, with patients, and with the public at large. He was recently selected to give a TED Talk in Dún Laoghaire in Ireland, and he is here with us to share his unique perspective with our audience. Pat, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Anish.
We're delighted to have you. I want to tell the audience how we got to know one another, because it's actually relevant. I was trying to retrace the steps that led us to not only meet for the first time, I think in 2015, but then later on develop a friendship and a correspondence. So in 2015, I met you here. You are involved. You may be the director of an advocacy group in Ireland, the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Foundation. And you were here promoting a documentary called The Widowmaker about, in my mind, it's about the shenanigans that went on regarding the use of the coronary calcium scan, the use or the misuse or the lack of use of the coronary calcium scan. And I thought it was a wonderful documentary. So I was invited by a woman who leads a patient advocacy group here in the Bay Area to watch the documentary. And I met you at that event. And I later on wrote a review on my blog of that documentary. And I shared it with you. And then you became aware of my blog, and I think you started following it. And at some point, I was writing about the question of health and what it means to be healthy, and you stimulated me to think more about that. And you asked me a question about, how doctors should deliver bad news, and you prompted me to read both Viktor Frankl's book, right, Man in Search of Meaning, exactly, and Atul Gawande's book on being mortal, and I wrote about that, and that's how we've known one another. But I had no idea at the time that you had multiple sclerosis, and perhaps you were already again. I know we met at a cafe. We had a breakfast together, and I don't know that I had a chance to observe you walk or not walk and so forth. So certainly it didn't. It was not apparent to me that you had this illness. And so now I'm going to turn this over to you and tell us a little bit, what your experience has been. I described it very briefly, but I want you to tell us a little bit more what's happened to you.
About 11 years ago, I got really odd sensations in my legs. It felt like the skin on my calves had shrunk and had become much too tight. And I got really worried that I knew there was something neurological going on, or something on my spinal cord, I thought. I got really concerned for about a week until I saw a neurologist that I might have a tumor on my spine, and that's what really worried me. So when I saw a neurologist, she diagnosed transverse myelitis, and I had to ask her to write that down for me so that I could go home and research it. And when I did, a couple of hours in, I realized I was going to have multiple sclerosis, and that was both a shock and a relief. A shock that I would have multiple sclerosis, and a relief that I was going to be alive, because spinal tumors, I don't think, have good outcomes. So I suppose that became the starting point of my journey with MS. Formal diagnosis occurred a couple of months later. That was about 11 years ago. And after that, I was well for a long time. I took up cycling because I could. I played golf and I continued to do that. I was very active, very involved. And oddly, though, my wife and I took a decision not to tell anybody about this because we didn't want our lives to change. We didn't want to be seen differently. We didn't want to be excluded from things. And at the time I was working for myself, and the business was property business, working at a business in Poland, and the markets were on the way down. And I thought, I might need a job in a year or 2 years' time if this doesn't work out. And I didn't want anybody to know about this because I felt that if people knew that I had multiple sclerosis, that I probably wouldn't be employable. I was 47, so I took that kind of seriously. I had 3 kids in school, and so that was the real concern. But the difficulty with that is that when you don't tell people and you don't have, it can't become the entire dinner table conversation. So it goes around and around in your head, and the prospect of it becoming progressive, it was a really haunting prospect because it sort of sits out there in the shadows. It's ever present. It's kind of waiting and watching, and it's threatening. And then about 5 years ago, it turned progressive. And we still hadn't told anybody. And even though it had begun to progress, I was still playing golf. And fortunately, most of the people in my golf club weren't doctors, so they didn't understand the difference between a neurological gait and an orthopedic gait. So I told them I had bad knees. And most people believed it until one day I was playing golf with a friend of mine who is a neurologist, a pediatric neurologist, and he spotted it. And I suppose I had to come clean. But at that stage, it was about 6 years in, and people knew that I hadn't changed fundamentally. I don't think I had changed, but yet I had changed a lot. I changed a lot because when I got faced with progression on my multiple sclerosis, I likened it to being drunk. And the drunk's problem was that it was more the width of the road that was bothering him than the length of it, because he was staggering over and back between the ditches rather than getting on down the road, getting on with life. And my difficulty with the start of the progression was that I was very concerned that if I accepted that I was going to have a progressive neurological disease, that I would become depressed, I would fall into victimhood, I would wonder why me. And on the other hand, if I fought it, and that was the one ditch, and on the other ditch, if I fought it and I failed to overcome, that I was concerned that I might actually fall into the original ditch, the depression and the victimhood. But I had to fight, and I did. So I started doing different diets and exercise. I was doing those when I was with you in San Francisco 3 years ago. And I eventually, a number of things happened. I'd gone to the UCSF to see Professor of Neurology there, the head of the Department of Neurology, and I asked him a question: what's my progression likely to be? And he said to me, and I'll quote this exactly because he allowed me to take the whole thing, he said, "Pat, you have a progressive form of multiple sclerosis, and progressive forms of multiple sclerosis tend to progress." I kind of thought, well, that wasn't great value for money as an answer, but when I thought about that a lot later, after I had probably gone down the road a bit further, I realized that he had actually done me a great service, because he hadn't sentenced me to what I call the tyranny of a diagnosis. Because if he had, that would have embedded in my brain, it would have gone right into my subconscious, and that would have become my outcome, because he was the professional and he knew better, and I would have wasted an enormous amount of energy trying to overcome that diagnosis and trying to form my own path. So he had given me the option, or he'd given me the ability to choose my own reality, and to choose how I think about multiple sclerosis and its progression, and to choose how my disease, how I should think about how my disease progresses. And that was a real gift. I also had read, as you know, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and one of my light bulb moments was that he said, you don't get to choose what happens to you in life, but you do get to choose how you think about it and react to it. And I certainly am a big believer that you're in control of your mind, if you take control of it and your outlook. And my mother used to always say that it's if everybody in the room put their troubles on the table, we each leave with our own. Because everybody's got troubles and challenges. Everybody. I don't know anybody that doesn't have them. And some of them are more visible. Mine are more visible. But I wouldn't swap with anybody, because I would give this MS back, but I wouldn't swap. because everybody is going to have challenges that they are that they've got to face, and I have a pretty good idea what mine are, or what my outcome is likely to be. I've had the coronary artery calcium scan, and I have a 0 score, so I'm in good shape. I've got the 15-year guarantee, as you know. So and then you'll remember I wrote to you about a friend of mine that died, and around that time she died, and her anniversary was actually on Thursday, and that changed my perspective, because I think I can still do things. I can still do a huge amount, and I changed my outlook. I let go on the things that I can't do anymore. I let go on the cycling. I put the golf behind me. I stopped worrying about things I can't do, and I focused on the things I can, which is reading and having great relationships, because these are the core things that keep you healthy, and because health in my view is a state of mind. It's not necessarily a physical thing. I'm in a wheelchair, I can barely stand up, just about stand up, so I think about health as a state of mind rather than as a physical thing. I can do everything I want to do, and if I can't do it, I don't want to do it. So that's kind of how I think about things. That's kind of a little bit of my journey.
Pat, tell us a little bit about, because you mentioned at some point you were trying different diets and trying to control things with, clearly this is a disease that we don't understand. And most chronic diseases, we fundamentally don't understand them, because if we did, we'd be able to treat them. And it's very tempting to do what you did, to try, to change things as much as possible. And for us doctors, it's very hard. I find it very hard to discourage patients from doing that, because I may not have anything to offer, or what I can offer may be very limited, and I can't exclude the possibility that there might be something in the diet. I mean, it's always plausible. And so how did you tell us a little bit how did that feel, and how you changed your mind, how you made the transition away from that approach?
Well, I suppose I started a diet which was a low-fat diet. It's the swank, a variation of the swank diet, and the swank. Yeah, I think and that was a lot of vegetables, fruit, and very, very low fat, less than 15 grams of saturated fat a day, and I probably had it lower than that. And I did that for about a year and a half, and I couldn't see any appreciable difference in it. And then I came across Terry Walls, who's who had a progressive form of multiple sclerosis and was in a wheelchair, like a zero gravity wheelchair, and got herself back walking. And hers was a very high fat diet, focusing on the mitochondria, and on very ketogenic. So I tried, and she has 3 forms of this, and I tried all 3 of them. And again, I did that for a number of months, and again, I couldn't see. I lost a lot of weight. I was, I'm weighing now about 85, 87 kgs. I was down to about 77, 78 kgs. So I looked gaunt. And I didn't, but it was turning the house upside down. It was separate meals for me. It was separate shopping lists for me. And when we went out to dinner, it was, what's on the menu. We were invited to people's houses. What's on the menu? No, I can't eat that. No, I can't eat that either. Can you, and there were separate things. And I was turning everybody's life upside down. And I realized that I had a very low chance or probability of making an impact on my MS. I had a very high chance of ruining all the relationships with the people that were important to me, my family, my wife, our friends. So, it became a no-brainer to say, look, I'm a population of 1. It may work for one person, or it may work for a lot of people, but it didn't work for me. So I gave it up.
Okay.
It wasn't hard.
Right. Were you tempted to look into alternative forms of medicine, supplements, other things of that sort?
Yeah, I did some of that stuff, but not in any serious way. I wondered to what extent it would work. But one of the things I found was that I asked again when I was in San Francisco. I asked, how does vitamin D work in MS? Because there's a huge correlation between latitude and the incidence of multiple sclerosis. The higher up you go, the less sun, the greater the incidence. And what I found was, I asked the head of the Department of Neurology in San Francisco, what is that correlation? And he said, we know there's a correlation, but we don't know whether it happens in utero, in childhood, or in adulthood. But what's unusual, what my experience in the medical system was that there's a huge concentration on drugs. But there's not so much of a concentration on alternatives that do no harm, but they may not work, but they don't do any harm. So why not try them? And on other things, I had to ask questions like, should I be taking vitamin D? And oh yeah, vitamin D is really important, and why didn't anybody tell me that? I'm 5 years in. So I find that a lot of the emphasis is on the drugs, the disease-modifying treatments, rather than on the on other things that we can do. So at the moment, for example, I'm chasing down neurorehabilitation to see if I can get on a neuro rehab program, so that I preserve whatever function I have in my legs, or don't lose any more of it. Because if I lose any more of it, well, then life will become even more inconvenient than it is now. But I just find a lot of there's a big incidence of emphasis on drugs. It's not all about drugs.
And not enough emphasis, perhaps as you've experienced about the state of mind of the patient. In fact, no emphasis whatsoever, I imagine, because you came to that change of mind on your own, in a way.
Largely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, largely. I suppose I've been through a lot of transition, work transition, particularly over the course of my career, and uncertainty and stress is something that I managed to master, or to get on top of at a reasonably early stage, probably in my 30s or late 30s. And I've read a lot on this and thought a lot about it, and I had time to think about it. So and from that point of view, I was reasonably quickly able, well, maybe not that reasonably quickly, but quickly enough able to turn my mind to the positive rather than to the negative. So for example, we did some work on our house to live downstairs last year, and one of the things that we did was we provided to put a sling in that, if I may need a sling to get in and out of bed, or to get me up, or to get me to go to the bathroom or whatever, but at the same time, that's there. I put it away. I don't worry about it. If it's needed, it's needed. But it's in the future. It's not in the now. And I have a huge amount to look forward to. I have a huge amount to do. I have a lot of writing and talking and and thinking to do. Because I'm nowhere near complete in my understanding of this disease or myself or how it would go. And I look forward to doing all that. And that's important.
So Pat, can I ask you what it is that you would have liked to have seen different in terms of some of the doctors that have spoken to you and about what is a chronic illness, and what?
I think the concentration is, I suppose, maybe I wasn't asked, how's your head about this? How are you thinking about it? Because my head was always in good shape. I remember arriving into my neurology clinic for my 6-monthly visit in cycling shorts, and this got a good giggle. Here's the guy with MS, and he's in his cycling shoes and cycling shorts, because I was in good shape. But it's I think as it progressed, probably a more holistic approach with looking at physiotherapy. Making sure that people have got the right frame of mind, that they're thinking about it right. Maybe I was, but I would like to have what else are you doing to help yourself? How's your sociability? What's your social life like? All that sort of stuff, because these are really important things. To me, I don't know if anybody has watched Robert Waldinger's talk on TED.com. The Harvard longitudinal study. What they discovered in that is that the people who were healthy in their 80s, when they went back to look at what the predictors of good health in the 80s it was relationships that they had in their 50s. Were they strong? Were they deep? Were they extensive? And to me, they're the really important things. Is having those relationships. Did anybody ask me about them? Not really.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen mostly neurologists for your care, or do you have how does it work? Do you have a primary care general practitioner who kind of coordinates things? Like who would you say your best relationship
My current neurologist, super guy. So I see him probably annually. I spent 5 weeks in hospitals this year, 4 weeks with asthma, and one with doing neuro rehabilitation. So I got a very good insight. I saw 5 different consultants in 5 different disciplines, over the 4 weeks in with asthma, because I got a lot of other stuff checked out. So I got a good insight on this. And a good insight on what it feels like to be a patient in a hospital situation. I've had loads of outpatient visits, but I've got a good idea of why hospitals work. And the big thing for me is that your caregiver, whoever that is, whether it's a nurse or a doctor, whether you can have some sort of relationship with them, even if it's only fleeting, that you make a connection with them, because connection is really, really important with your caregiver, and particularly your doctor, because if you feel connected with them, and you've written about this, I know, Michelle, on doctor-patient relationships, but that connection is really important, because that builds a trust, and it builds an understanding, because the communication between doctors and patients, there's a huge asymmetry of knowledge between the doctor and the patient. And this is something that I talk about, is that how do you break down that asymmetry of understanding so that the patient actually buys into their own recovery? Because if you don't get the patient to buy into their own recovery, I don't think they recover as well.
May I ask what makes this particular neurologist that you've been seeing much better, or can you contrast some things that he does well that you feel like other neurologists that you've come into contact with don't do well?
I think he's interested in me. I think we've discussed the strategy in terms of where we go in the medium to long term. That we try and keep the legs as best as we can, preserve what we have. He's looking at a new disease modifying therapy for me, which is about to be approved. I think in Ireland it's the new drug ocrelizumab. And and I think that gives me some optimism.
Is it that he gives you more hope than, say, other neurologists that you...
It's not. I'm kind of not a great believer in hope. I think hope and fear are flip sides of the same coin, and I think you've got to be positive. You've got to look forward to the future. You've got to be accepting, and it's a belief that he's working with me, that he's thinking, that he's listening to the things to my priorities, that he's responding to those, and that he understands how I'm thinking, and he's bought into me, not just in the narrow focus, but on a much broader focus.
Pat, I want to explore a little bit this positivity that you think is essential. And I don't know that if my question will make sense, but let me ask you: does the positivity is it from within you that you can actually sort of will it, or is it that you recognize positive things in the world around you? Is it?
No, it's not a willpower thing, Michelle.
Okay, so that's what correct.
I don't just summon it up at will.
Right.
It's not something that I have to work at, because it's not a self-control thing. Self-control is a limited resource, and if you've got to exercise that all the time, you're going to run out of it. So it's an outlook. It's a way of thinking. It's an optimism. It's a belief in the things I can do. It's not getting bothered by the things I can't. It's
right.
To other people's company and share it.
I'm glad you're saying that, and I think that's correct. I mean, it has to be, for this to be sustainable, it has to be that there is goodness out there in the world, and therefore there is goodness in being alive.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the bottom line. Because otherwise, if you had to muster the positivity out of your own will, I mean, it would really, you as you said, you sort of run out. It's really
it's unsustainable. Yeah.
Right. So there's some goodness, which means that it's also, and the good thing about it is that it's impervious in a way to whatever will happen, because in a sense, it's going to progress, right? It's just a matter of time. And there's goodness no matter what, because the goodness is out there, you're not constructing it or making it contingent on
No.
a certain state of affair. And even if you're and all of us, it doesn't have anything to do with MS. It can be all of us, our minds weaken as we age and so forth, and we don't need to rely on the soundness of our minds for this positive outlook. It's just a matter of recognizing it in being alive and just being part of the world, because there are, not to deny, there are bad things, and of course as you said, the MS is not a good thing. You don't necessarily want it or wish that you could wish, but nevertheless, there's sufficiently good. There are sufficiently good things out there in the world that just the mere fact of being alive is what is positive.
Yeah, yeah. I'm of the view that like a really good friend of mine, 59, died about 3 weeks ago. Beautiful girl, and it's really sad. When you see somebody in their prime with much to do taken away. So I'm grateful for being above ground. I'm grateful for having a clear mind. I used to say there were three things that were important to me when I got MS: that I was above ground, that my brain was clear, and that I was upright. Well, I'm no longer upright, but I'm alive and I have a clear head, and I'm fortunate in that my MS is a motor form that's limited to my legs, and it's not a cognitive form, because if it's cognitive, well then, you're in trouble. I don't have any pain either, and that makes a big difference. But I do protect my well-being. I do get a lot of spasms in my legs and cramp. But I can take drugs for that, but I don't take them because that interferes with my well-being, because they upset my stomach, and if my stomach is upset, well, then I don't feel well. And if I don't feel well, I'm not in good form, and then I can't do the things I want to do. So I do protect my well-being, and I make trade-offs for that.
Right, but let me press you on this, because what if you had a painful condition? What if pain was involved, or what if your cognition was somehow clouded? Would that how would that change things for you in terms of your ability to still, continue to be positive?
I suppose I haven't been there, Michelle, so I don't know. And this is a journey, and I'm finding out all the time that as I'm learning new things all the time as I go down this road, and some of them surprise me, and some of them don't. But I'm reasonably resilient. I'm quite accepting. Or it's and I'm slightly stoic about this. That you've got to love the faith that's given you. And you've got to love it, because if you don't love it, and you don't grow through the adversity and the challenge. I wish I wish adversity on people, not for the sake of adversity, but for the growth that they get from it. From the understanding of self, and from the awareness, and from the strength that comes from it. Not from the bad that it does them. But that's for those who can actually stand up to it. And I've been fortunate in that I can manage adversity. I can deal with it. I can accept it. And I can turn it to good. I can talk about it. I did a talk about a month ago to a lunchtime talk for Wellness Week in a firm of solicitors or lawyers in town about growing through adversity. And it's something that kids don't get enough of now. I don't think they get enough adversity. They don't see enough difficulty, and they. Because those that have it, they'll grow from it and benefit from it.
Right. I hear you. One thing that I remark, occasionally I'll have someone who's very down on the, about their condition. But even people who are, extremely depressed, frequently, if you notice, they'll get dressed in the morning, right? They may shave. They may do something. So there's something that they do that indicates that they're still looking forward to something. even if at one level, with their rational mind, they may say, oh, the outlook is terrible. But at the same time, with their body, they're going out, they're having a meal, they're eating, they're saying hello,
Yeah.
they're doing things which reflects a little bit of a contradiction when they say, if they tell me that they've lost, they don't want to go on anymore, they've lost their will to live, and so forth. So I think, to me, it's perhaps for the doctor, for the healthcare professional, it's important to point that out to a patient who may be seeing things very negatively and having a very hard time. And it's not to minimize or to negate the difficulty of the illness, because the illness is, of course, very, very difficult. But it's to refocus, as I think what you've done, sort of refocus the attention on what is still worthwhile and positive out there, so long as as life goes on.
Yeah, to me, the critical thing is, is relationships. It's because the relationships are what keep you alive. It's, so I would probably meet or talk to, outside of my working environment, somewhere between 5 and 10 people a week, and that is, to me, about the value of keeping in touch with people, of sharing insights, of talking to them about issues things that are going on in their lives, the thoughts that they have, that I've thought about, or that I can add value to them, and that gives me a huge buzz. So and connectivity is really important, and it's connectivity with other people. It's, I don't know if a worthwhile book reading is called Lost Connection with Johann Hari, and he talks about having depression, and for him the depression was lack of connectivity to other people, to friendships, to a secure future, to meaningful work, to meaningful values. And if you don't have meaning in your life, well then, and meaningful conversation that stimulate, the kind of thinking that I'm doing, or that I'm trying to do, or that stimulate conversations that have got value to you and value to the other person. Well, then it's kind of hard to have, much of life. You don't get much satisfaction out of, vacuous conversation. Right. So meaningful conversation is really, really important.
And at some point, I don't know if it was in your talk or somewhere else, I've heard you speak to the effect that early on your visits with the specialists were very brief, and frequently they would just give you the technical aspects of things, and then you spend time with a clinical nurse specialist. And at the beginning, you were a little bit, you felt shortchanged about that.
Yeah, so let me explain that.
Go ahead,
so,
yes.
So I always thought that, my visits should be with the specialist, with the consultant, or the attending, or whoever it was. So I could ask them a lot of questions. I could ask all the questions and get my mind clear. And often the visits were 30, 40 minutes. And, fair play to the guys that took the time. Some of them were very good. But there is a huge asymmetry of understanding between the specialist and the patient. And, in one of my talks, I asked, whose responsibility is it to ensure the listener understands? And in our culture, it's the speaker's responsibility to ensure the listener understands. But I'm not sure that's well understood, by a lot of doctors, because, and I'm guessing I do understand this, that if you're telling the same things over and over again, and it's very familiar to you, you forget that it's not very familiar to the patient. So a lot of the times, I was taking up a lot of consultant time, and then I realized that I found myself with clinical nurse specialists, and when I spoke to them, there was much less of an asymmetry of understanding. I got to say things that were on my mind. They were listening to me, and I was asking questions, and I cleared up a lot of the things that were less relevant and less important, so that when I saw the consultant or the the specialist, I asked him the important questions, and I was coming at it from a point of view of some understanding, or some basic understanding, and it became much more productive for both of us. So the role of the support staff, particularly the nursing staff, is really, really important, because they tend to have more time to deal with you as a one-on-one. They get much more of a feel for the person, because they spend more time on them. And then they can also interpret between you and the consultant, because they kind of understand what you're thinking. So that was a very productive and insightful. For me, it was insightful to understand the real role of the nurse specialist.
I agree. I think they do play a very important role in that regard, and sometimes it's inevitable that the doctors, the specialists in particular, will need to limit their time with every patient. By virtue of the division of labor and so forth, and they can use extenders, to fill the gap there, as you've experienced. Pat, what you spoke to medical students, I believe, right, a few months ago?
Yeah, I do. I suppose my speaking started about 2 years ago. I was asked we were 35 years out of college, and I was asked if I would give the welcome address to our 35-year reunion, and I did. And as a result of that, then I started asking. I enjoyed it, and I started asking friends, who had lecturing positions. I said, do you have the guest lectures? And one said, yes. And I said, great, put me down, and he did. And then I was talking to the professor of general practice in one of the medical schools in Dublin. And I said to him, you must have guest lectures. So he said, he put me down for their early patient engagement program as part of the general practice module. So, and this was when you get a patient in front of the group of first years, and then you ask them to present their case. And I said I'd do it, but provided I could ask them questions as well. So the start of my talk was what is health? And because and I got two answers generally, but I did kind of, you have to sort of force the answers out, but I got two answers. The first was absence of disease, and the other one was well-being, broadly. And then I asked them what's illness, and that's easier. And then I asked them, what's the purpose of the healthcare system? And generally the answers are, well, to fix you when you get sick. And then I asked them, what's your role going to be when you become doctors? Why'd you sign up for medicine? Why didn't you become lawyers or busmen or firefighters? And generally they said, well, we want to make people better. So and then I tell my story and my own story about health and illness, and I come back then to challenge them. Let's go back over what is health, and I tell them that health is a state of mind. It's your view in your future. It's about your well-being. It's not necessarily absence of disease. I know that's the UN definition, or not the.
It's the dictionary definition in a way. Yes, right,
but you can be chronically ill, as I am. You can be very healthy at the same time.
Right.
I don't like the term ill health, because it suggests that illness and health are on some sort of a continuum, that as you dial up the illness, you dial down the health, or that they're flip sides of the same coin. They're not. You can see them in two different dimensions.
Right. So Pat, let me ask you how the most difficult conversations, for me at least, relate to patients whose prognosis is poor. I mean, and so how speaking from your view, do you have any advice in terms of how we should approach those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that. Atul Gawande talks about this in his book Being Mortal, and he contrasts Doctor Informative, which is these are the stats, these are this is your outlook, this is what's going to happen, expect this, and as with the doctor who gets involved in what you call an ask, tell, ask relation session, where he says he starts off with "I'm worried." And he allows the patient to walk into it gently, as the thing from crashing them into their diagnosis. Because if you crash somebody into their diagnosis, you've stolen their hope, whatever hope they have. And you need to allow people to come to their own realization as to what their outlook is likely to be. and allow them to reach that in their own time. Because I think, and there's, there's a big debate about, the need for honesty, and to tell patients what their outlook is, not to hold back on them. But at the same time, I think there's a sensitivity to the human capacity to absorb all of that, and the human capacity to come to terms with, with terminal illness. And I think that's the skill of the doctor, is to know which patient I have, and which of those methods should I use, and how do I use it, to tell the truth, to give people time. And I suppose, it depends on the amount of time that people have left, because, people do want time to, establish their legacies and settle their relationships and make peace with God, and, make sure that those who are left behind will be okay. And if you don't give them the time to do that, but, if it's really quick that they're going to be taken away, but if there is time, I think you need to think about, what do they really want, and how do they want to hear it, and allow them to hear it, and be sensitive to that, while still doing your duty.
So I'm asked sometimes to give risk stratification from a cardiac standpoint for surgery.
Sure.
And so, it's not atypical that there'll be a patient, say, who has a infection in their spine, and start looking over things. Infections in their spine are somewhat pretty not good things that are associated with lots of bad things happening. Not the least of pain, and certainly if it's not treated, things can go very badly. Now, this particular patient also has advanced liver disease from long-standing use of alcohol, and has advanced liver disease to the point that the blood is very thin, the platelet count is very low, and it appears that to you as the medical consultant that this person's mortality at 6 months just from severe liver disease is very, 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 very high, meaning the chances that they have a bad event from this is high. What should how does one go about trying to help this patient? You're talking about all these things, and there's a massive asymmetry in terms of doctor and patient.
Yeah.
And here, the narrow question from the consultant and from the patient is, is this surgery something that's a good idea? Essentially, correct? Should we operate on this person's spine, take all the risks, and with us having some type of basic understanding that this person's underlying disease is their severe liver disease that will ultimately take their life? How do you go around approaching that without somehow robbing? I mean, trying to get down to practical side of what you're saying is, you want to be the type of person who doesn't rob hope. You want to be somebody who doesn't crash the person into their diagnosis. And this person has not been crashed in their diagnosis over and over, for years, and they've had slowly progressive significant liver disease. Now things have come to a head. Is this something that's wise? How do you at the moment make these decisions, or how would you approach that?
I would think about this person as, my father and my mother, and I would say, what would I say to them? How would I think about them if there was somebody that were very close to me, that had important meaning to me, and recognizing already that they have knowledge that they're not in good shape from the liver disease, and they now have a complication, which puts them at significant risk. And you say to them, and I think at that point you've got to sit down and say, look, you are aware, how aware of you are your circumstances and its potential outcomes. And these are the questions that Atul Gawande talks about. He said, what are your fears and what are your hopes? And what trade-offs are you willing to make and not willing to make? And then what's the best course of action that serves that understanding? So I think I'd be asking them, how aware are you of the risks that are involved in this? And, would you like me to explain them? And how is that going to change your outcome? It could change it to the extent that you don't come through the surgery and, you know, and you die. And the risks of that are this, and the risks that if you don't do something is that, you know, well, we're all going to die at some point, you know, but probably because of your underlying disease, you know, you have accelerated the time, you know, to mortality, you know, but this is something that, you know, I think needs to be dealt with sensitively, and you need to take them through their choices as sensitively as you can, you know, without destroying their hope, you know, whatever hope they've got left, you know, and destroying their chance to come to terms with you know, at their own pace. You know, now if it's something that's urgent, you either do it, you've got to perform this operation or they die now, or is it something, you know, and that will depend on how quickly you break this news. But it's, you know, all the circumstances are different. But I do think that you want to give them an informed, you know, is in as sensitive a way as you can. You know,
let me ask an even more provocative question. You know, you're obviously a highly learned intellectual guy who's very well read. You went to university. I'm sorry. Your prior. You work as. I
work as a consultant for you know, for a multinational company. Yeah.
Right. So you're, you know, I don't know, in the top, I don't know, 10% or so in terms of folks, in terms of how, you know, educated you necessarily are. Now, a large percentage of the patients that we end up dealing with, as you know, is with folks with a low socioeconomic status, and what goes with low socioeconomic status many times is a significant lack of you know, education and whatnot. And this is not to argue about how the bigger conversation about how one ends up in terms of society being inequitable and who you're born to and where your place is and initial conditions and whatnot. But simply from the point of, again, from my point of, all right, this has been going on for 40 years. This person is not you, frankly, Pat, in terms of being able to have this type of conversation, in terms of being able to walk them through this type of thing. They may have a 7th or 8th grade education, correct? So would it be, you know, how do you, is it reasonable as a physician to take a more paternalistic approach to folks that you judge don't have the type of abilities that, say, somebody like you has?
Well, you see, I suppose, let me put it this way. I think everybody, I probably have thought a bit more about you know, health and illness, not life and death. You know, I'm probably more existential than the majority of the population. But I don't doubt that everybody has an understanding of, you know, I don't see. I think I'm a big thinker on education as well. I distinguish education from qualifications. So we have qualifications. The people you're talking about don't, you know, but they have got different experiences, and they, you know, they have educations in things that we don't ever understand or will never understand, and you know, they've got life experiences, but they're not short of an understanding of life and death, I think, you know, and you don't have to have, you know, a degree in, you know, in commerce in my case, or, you know, qualified as an accountant, or in yours as a cardiologist, you know, to understand the basic, you know, nature of life and death and the choices around, you know, around, do you understand your situation? You know, that you are in a really difficult place here, you know, and I can explain to you, you know, what the likelihoods are, you know, and I think if you know, if you sit down and you allow people to process, this is the really important part, is that you allow people, your patients, to process in their own way, and you help them to process in their own way and in their own words what their situation is. And that takes I think that takes probably more time than you may have, but, you know, allow them to feed back to you what they've heard, and then help them to, you know, to deepen their understanding of that in whatever way. And if you deal with that sensitively and you deal with it compassionately, I think that is, it's to help them to get to process in their own mind and to find words to say in their own words what they understand from that, because they will have words to understand it. They're not the words that you and I would use, but they will have their own words.
I think I'm going to agree with both of you, Anish and Pat, because on the one hand, I think, Pat, you're correct. Frequently, I see that a person's ability to have insights or grasp the reality of the situation sometimes has very little to do with their socioeconomic status. I've seen very wealthy people who are completely overwhelmed when when they have some kind of health thing and they really can't think clearly at all, and vice versa. But I do think that, and I think as you said, so the doctor has to have some insight about what the patient is, where he's at, and part of the work is to put yourself in the patient's shoes and see what the experience is from that perspective. But I think Anish is correct that sometimes it's better to be not to say too much. You may be better off just making a decision and telling the patient, in this example, we're not going to do surgery. Surgery is not going to. We're not going to do surgery here. We're going to try. We're going to take care of you. We're going to continue to do X, Y, and Z, and not have to explain too much. We're forced now, very much by the current medical culture, to articulate everything and to put this on a platter to the patient and say, "Here, you choose. You choose what outcome. What are the pros and cons? What are the trade-offs?" and put numbers to all of these things and whatnot.
Is it
in
possible?
Fact, I don't think it's charitable. I think the right thing to do is to actually make a decision, but make it for the patient in what we judge to be the best interest of the patient. And
but I think it's I do think though that in informing that judgment, that you have to be sure in your own mind that you've listened to what the patient has to say. That you've heard them, and that they feel that you've heard them. Because if they don't feel that you've heard them, well, then the patient feels disempowered or disenfranchised. And I've been with doctors where I didn't feel I had any voice, and I felt somewhat disenfranchised. But yeah, I think you're right. There is the doctor, but it's important that you balance that. The view that the right thing to do is here, with having been satisfied that you've heard your patient, and you've taken the time to listen, because listening is a really, really, it's quite a skill.
Correct, it is, and ultimately, and it's not perfect, and it doesn't work it may not work very well, but ultimately, if you don't have these good relationships as a doctor, your reputation should suffer, right? I mean, yes. The patient may not be able to say anything, but maybe he'll talk to his family and say, "Listen, this guy, I don't have a good feeling about him."
Yeah.
It may not help that particular patient for that, but the word might spread that you're not a doctor who listens, and in a way you should be penalized for that.
Let me give you an example. A friend of mine came visit me when I was in hospital, and he's a retired surgeon. And he was telling me a story about he's sending his brother-in-law to, who I can't remember what sort of problem he has. He said, "I'm going to send you to this so-and-so, Dr. X. He's the best guy in the business. Now, he's a bit gruff, but he's the best guy." And I said to him, "Hang on a second. If he's gruff, he's not the best guy. Because the best guy is the guy that allows you to, like I said, buy into your own recovery, that'll explain to you what's going on, that you've got the time to process in your own mind, and come to your own understanding of the situation. It's not good enough just to be technically proficient. So one of the things I say when I talk to the first year med students, I said, is when you qualify, you'll have probably fewer than half the skills you need to be a good doctor, because the other half, you'll have learned to treat diseases, but people have diseases. And if you don't understand, whether the people, or you can relate to the people, I said, well, then you're in difficulty. So I said, the test for you is this: go down to the local bar, sit up on a bar stool, start talking to the person left and right of you. And if you can get good out of that and enjoy it, and they do, well, I said, you're probably in a good place. And if not, we'll think of epidemiology or pathology or hematology or something that's in research, rather than people facing, because, you've got to remember the people dimension. in the healthcare. It's not just the disease that you're treating.
That's right.
The doctor treating. Yeah, it's really, really important.
Pat, before we close here, I want to go back to your this positivity, this positive outlook.
Yeah.
The doctors may not, despite doing the best that they can, it may not be something that they can instill in a patient, and it may take time for the patient to come to that point. Do you have any thoughts about the value of therapy to help people get to that point? And I know that there's a school of psychotherapy that follows Viktor Frankl's
Yes.
sort of a brand of existentialism. There may be other schools of psychotherapy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I did a course, a Stanford course called Living Well with Chronic Illness about 2 years ago. And it's a friend of mine had been to Stanford to do this course, and she's rolling it out now for cancer care for cancer care, National Cancer Care Program. I spoke at that a couple of weeks ago. I gave my TED talk at it. But I think patients need to be empowered to understand the things they can do for themselves. So this was a course. It was 6 2.5-hour sessions over once a week. It was given by people with chronic illness, for people with chronic illness, and it helped people. It gave them a toolkit of things that can help them to manage themselves, to help them to understand what they're going through. And I thought it was really, really valuable. Now I went into a lot of positivity, and I was very interested from an observational point of view. But I got some good things out of it as well. So I think and I was talking to a guy who's a pain consultant, and saying, how do you help people to cope with pain? And he said, well, we give them this 2-week course. And I said, like, what, do you talk at them for 2 weeks? And it was kind of, yeah. And I said, well, look, you should get a pain version of this, so that people get to understand, how to manage their pain, or to do better to understand it and try and manage it. Because, and that's one of the things that came out of the Harvard study as well, is that people who have great relationships don't feel the pain as acutely as people who don't. I think that's an important insight. That if you're on your own, you feel your pain, but you suffer more from pain than if you don't. And pain and suffering aren't necessarily the same thing. You can have a lot of pain and not suffer. Suffering is how you deal with it. So I think. There's some thoughts there.
Well, relationships are key, including the doctor-patient relationship, which is unfortunately in tatters, but hopefully can be re-strengthened. Pat, thank you so much for joining us. It was a terrific conversation, great insights, I think very inspiring in many ways. And we'll put that on the show notes, but do you write on a blog, or do you have can people follow you for about what you're talking about? And
I don't have a blog, but that's one of my jobs over the holidays, is to get something going on this. And I think there are two things that have happened recently. My TEDx talk and this podcast that are going to give me something to talk about, something to write about, and so I'm looking forward to that. I thank you for the opportunity. I thank you both for the opportunity, for sharing some of my thoughts. I hope some people get some value from them. When my TED talk goes up, it's not up yet. I'd love people to look at it. It would be TED.com/Caslin.
We'll have it on the show notes for sure.
Yeah. So look, thanks again, Michelle. Thank you, Anish. Great questions, and I hope that some of your listeners will get some value from them.
I'm sure they will. Thank you very much, Pat.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.